And so it does feel like times have changed. Things are different. The US and Europe are becoming a bit more isolated on the global stage. China cutting the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it looks like they were reestablishing formal relations in China this week. Normally, those are the types of things that used to happen at the White House, and now they're happening in Beijing, and so it's interesting to see. There's a lot of debate about the U.S. dollar hegemony and what this all means, and so on. And I don't want to sort of be in the camp that this is the signpost of the imminent demise of the U.S. dollar system, because we don't believe it is. But it is notable, it is historic, and it is worth keeping a very close eye on.
On today's episode of the Finance Podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Doomberg for the third time. Obviously he doesn't need any introduction. So Doomberg, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Anthony, my pleasure. Thanks for having me back. Always great to talk to you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, really looking forward to this because we've had quite a lot of news. So last weekend, there was a lot of talk about OPEC plus, lots of countries sort of collaborating together to actually reduce the supply of oil. Was this them trying to sort of flex their muscles and show that they have control over the oil markets? Or is this more maybe a bit of a warning about the lack of demand that we're seeing, especially with the Chinese open? What's your thoughts on
that? Probably a mix of all of the above. I would say probably the best reporting on this surprise decision by OPEC Plus has been done by the Financial Times, one of the few great newspapers still in circulation that does actual investigative reporting. And they reported that this was driven in large part by Saudi Arabia's frustration with the Biden administration's refusal to refill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, apparently as sort of handshake promised when Biden was visiting Saudi Arabia. To give some context for the listeners and viewers on some numbers, the surprise cut amounted to roughly 1.5 million barrels a day of target production, which in reality is closer to probably 1 million barrels a day of actual production taken offline, which is roughly the amount of oil that Biden was releasing from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve into the midterm elections. And if the reporting in the Financial Times and a subsequent follow-up report in the Wall Street Journal are to be believed, it sounds like it was expected by Saudi Arabia that with oil prices nearing $70 a barrel, that Biden would begin to refill the SPR. And a few days before the surprise Sunday evening announcement, U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm was out saying it could take, quote, several years before the administration would think about beginning to refill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And in fact, there's a whole series of previously mandated sales from the reserve. And one of those was accelerated into the spring this year to soften the blow of the spring driving season in the U.S. And so I happen to think the surprise cut signifies a ever deteriorating state of the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, and in particular the Biden administration, which is the subject of a future piece of Doomberg. We're running string on that topic now, trying to see what we could add to what's already been reported. So it's also, of course, potentially due to softening demand with the banking crisis in the U.S. and so on. But I think that's sort of a nice bonus for OPEC Plus. I do believe this is deeply personal, and egos of global leaders should never be minimized in trying to explain their behavior.
Yeah, it's amazing how, I guess, badly the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US has gone over the past few years with the Biden administration. But what we've seen in the past is when they sort of bring in these cuts or they try and reduce supply, a lot of the time some of the members don't actually comply. And that's been a massive issue and almost continues to decrease the price even further. Do you think that's something that we could see potentially moving forward? Or do you think there's more, especially from Saudi Arabia, there's more focus on keeping the cuts as they are?
I would say in the past few years, in fact, what we've seen is an inability to achieve their targets due to the increasing complexity of finding the marginal barrel of oil. And if anything, I think they might even underperform these sets of targets. So I do think this time there will be good discipline amongst OPEC Plus. I think many of the member states have gotten accustomed to the excess profits they enjoy at these price levels and would be willing to sacrifice a bit of volume in order to maintain margins, especially Saudi Arabia, which along with Russia amount to 2/3 of the cuts. And so I don't think in this instance it's going to be an example of a bunch of cheating to the upside. I would be surprised, of course, anything is possible, but our view is that this is a real cut. And the price action, and by the way, post-cut reflects that. Oil retook $80 a barrel and kept it into the weekend. And so it does feel like times have changed. Things are different. The US and Europe are becoming a bit more isolated on the global stage. China cutting the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it looks like they were reestablishing formal relations in China this week. Normally, those are the types of things that used to happen at the White House, and now they're happening in Beijing. And so it's interesting to see, there's a lot of debate about the US dollar hegemony and what this all means and so on. And I don't want to sort of be in the camp that this is the signpost of the imminent demise of the US dollar system, because we don't believe it is, but it is notable, it is historic, and it is worth keeping a very close eye on.
Yeah, I find that shocking because if you think about it, Saudi Arabia and Iran they've almost been a proxy war for sort of 10 years trying to put their control over the Middle East, and now China have somehow brought them onto the negotiating table. And, we don't know what that means or what that will do, but it just shows you how poorly the US has done to, if they're driving enemies together.
Well, proxy for who, right? Saudi Arabia was a proxy for the United States. And so, now that that relationship has deteriorated, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Ultimately, we're not big fans of war, as you can imagine, and we don't really understand why nationalism runs so wild in the world. In an ideal world, everybody would get along and produce to their maximum capabilities and would have free-flowing global trade, and everybody's standard of living would be elevated. We don't have that today. We have a series of nationalistic countries that are, at war, the U.S. among them. It's rare is the time where we're not in direct or indirect combat with other nations. And so such necessities require ever-shifting loyalties and practicalities and realpolitik approaches. And I think that's what we're seeing in the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's in their strategic interest to make nice with each other and present a unified front in partnership with China against what they perceive as a U.S. enemy actor now. I mean, I think it's not controversial to say that the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. is to the left of neutral and closer to hostile than it used to be. That's for sure. And so time will tell. Perhaps this is an aberration, and perhaps leadership changes on either side, forced or otherwise, will eventually re-scramble the pieces on the chessboard. But as it stands now, the sort of BRICS countries, plus Iran, pick a few others thrown in there, suddenly you've got half the global population expressing a desire for a new economic order. Whether they can succeed or not, and whether that success is meaningful to the existing system that we both operate in, remains to be seen. But there's just no question that these headlines are accelerating. And what they ultimately mean will be, we're living through very historic times, let's put it that way. And I think when the future historians look back on the post-COVID world, I think this will be seen as transformative.
Yeah, and it's scary to think that they have, a lot of the commodity production as well as the manufacturing production as well. So there's a lot of, I guess, control that they could potentially have over there.
Well, if we got out of our own way, it wouldn't be so bad over here. We've often said that if you drew a circle around NAFTA, Mexico, Canada, the United States, you have an economic superpower. I mean, the U.S. is the world's largest energy producer, 12 million barrels a day, more than Saudi Arabia. By far the world's largest natural gas producer. It has, between Canada and the United States, the breadbasket of the world, the largest fresh water supplies, access to technologies to exploit all of our resources, fertilizer, vibrant workforce in Mexico and southern United States. The pieces are in place for NAFTA to more than hold its own on a global scale. But if we see sort of this multipolar world, we might have to give up our global ambitions, I suppose, and be satisfied with looking inward. That doesn't seem to be in the cards, at least with the current administration.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, so because OPEC have made these decisions in the short term, do you see that anything changing in the US for the Biden administration or from anywhere else to try and maybe increase production or any other things they can do to maybe reduce the impact this has on the everyday person?
Yeah, we wrote a piece last week called Between a Rock and a Hard Place, where we outlined the vice that Joe Biden has put himself in. It's a vice of his own making, where on one side he has the radical Malthusian elements of the environmental movement that form a key foundation of his political base, and on the other side is the hard reality of physics. Um, and Joe Biden is an old school politician. We remember him. We used to call him, Joe Biden D, DuPont, because he would basically be DuPont's senator. DuPont being the largest company in Delaware when he was senator for that state. He knows full well how commodities work and defended DuPont's interests with a regularity that would surprise many. And he's an old school politician who believes that the price of gasoline at the pump is the primary dictator of future electoral success or failure. And so this is why, of course, he panicked in 2022 and emptied the Strategic Petroleum Reserve ahead of the midterm election, because prices had passed $5 a gallon, and this was unacceptable politically to him. And he was correct, and it worked. He didn't get wiped out in the midterms. His party more than held their own. And so when push comes to shove, Biden will throw the environmental movement under the bus. And he did so in the piece we were talking about by approving the Willow oil project up in the Alaska National Oil Reserves. And of course, his environmental allies were outraged and have sued and all of those things. But I do think Biden is not, he's playing footsie with the environmentalists. I don't think he's a true believer. I think he realizes that we won't be quitting our addiction to fossil fuels anytime soon, and that any politician who allows the price of gasoline to exceed $5, $6, $7, $10 a gallon will be kicked out of the White House with pitchforks behind him or her. And so this is a reality on the ground, and Biden acknowledges it. And he says all the right things, of course, about climate change and solar and wind and all of that jazz. But in reality, we're 85% of our primary energy still comes from fossil fuels, despite $1 trillion being spent to try to break that. And I don't doubt that we'll spend waste another trillion trying. But in the end, if we don't have the fossil fuel companies producing life-nourishing energy for us, society breaks down pretty quickly.
Yeah, and do you think his foreign policy has been strategic as well? If you look at it, is he trying to do sort of a them against us? They're trying to destroy the US exceptionalism, the US power that they have over the world, trying to create peace. Do you think that's on purpose, or is it just a continuing missteps on their part?
I would prefer to live in a world where the US was a little less adventurous in its foreign policy. I think, again, I'm old enough to remember when being anti-war was considered a liberal position, and now being uncomfortable with foreign wars somehow makes you a Putin apologist or an alt-right nut job. We're neither of those, of course, but just even with China and Taiwan, looks like we're heading towards ever increasing friction between Biden and President Xi, and we'll see. With the latest senior political leader visit to Taiwan and China's response, it just feels like there was a time when we would hesitate to get into kinetic conflicts with nuclear superpowers. And, as a father of draft eligible children, if we're going to go to war, I would like at least my congressman to have the chance to vote on it. It seems like we are pretty adventurous, relying solely on executive power to, if, for example, if Seymour Hersh's controversial reporting on how the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, if that turns out to be true, we would mark that as a scandal of historic proportions. And it seems like the media has put a complete blackout on that story. I don't know. I just feel like our political leaders are a little too comfortable with war, and we would prefer they wouldn't be.
Yeah, I agree. It's scary to think. So yeah, if we go over to Europe, you mentioned there the destruction of the sort of Nord Stream pipeline, and that's really, I guess you could say, it's probably destroyed any chance that Russia and Europe are collaborating on maybe energy in the near future, at least for, well, we could say, natural gas. So we talked a few months ago and we were saying that there's, still concern about Europe making it through the winter. Obviously, it looks like we've made it through. We've had we've had good weather. Is everything behind? Have they made the right investments to sort of maybe prepare for next winter? Do you think there'll be further concern next winter, or what do you think's happened? Why did we get through this winter, and what does this mean for the next one?
Yeah, we wrote a piece at the end of December called "The Whims of Gaia," where we highlighted just how unusual the warm weather was historically. It was a, Four Sigma event to the warm side, and thank God it was, because that was the primary driver of Europe successfully making it through the winter without even more damage than had already occurred. And I would say there are many people minimizing that damage on Twitter today and in the sort of commentary world. But it's important to take a step back and see the price that was paid in order to, quote, get through winter. Germany famously scoured the world to buy every BTU of energy they could get their hands on, regardless of price, carbon footprint, or impact on the emerging world. And there is a huge impact on price, on carbon footprint, and on the emerging world. Germany wasted $500 billion and brought back coal at an epic speed at 16 gigawatts of coal power, making Germany's electricity grid one of the dirtiest in the continental European area. And of course, many emerging economies have been thrown into disarray, Pakistan most notably, but others as well. And they have been burned. And we wrote a piece to this effect, basically saying that the developing world watched what Germany did and will now henceforth ignore what they say. And they are all reinvesting in coal. Indonesia, China, Pakistan. Pakistan committed to never having this happen again. They had reoriented their economy around ready access to cheap liquefied natural gas. And by bidding the carriers of LNG up to historic prices, Germany, there are consequences to that. And so we're the first to admit that the winter passed with far fewer problems than we had thought might occur. But at the same time, let's hope that the leaders of Europe don't confuse luck with strategic insight, and that they don't learn all the wrong lessons from this narrow escape. Although Germany looks set to close its 3 final nuclear power plants here in the coming weeks. And Lord knows that's about as dumb a policy as we can imagine. But, let's see how they do next winter.
Yeah, it does seem that the fact that they got through it will mean, we don't have to change anything. Everything will be okay. Just go back to normal. But
well, imagine if we have a 4 Sigma weather to the other side. Yeah, right. I mean, it's possible. I mean, look, nobody is happier than we are. But we have thousands of paying subscribers in Europe. We would like Europe to do well. We would like Europe to thrive. We have many friends in Europe. I've visited the continent dozens of times. Nobody's sitting here cheering for a bad outcome so that we could somehow be, quote, proven right. We don't care about that. We would like correct policy decisions to be made for as many people on the planet as possible, including Europeans. And so to the extent that all the wrong lessons are going to be learned, then next winter's just going to be another roll of the dice, and we will still be hoping for a lucky outcome that avoids the maximum amount of pain for the fewest number of people. You know what I'm trying to say? And so we shall see. Yeah.
Yes, and I guess if we look at current energy prices now, they've gone. If we look at natural gas, it's obviously peaked in August, and then it's sort of continued to go down. Coal's obviously continued to go down as well. What are you thinking? Do you think we will see a similar phenomenon to last year as we see this year, where these countries will realize, we have to try and guarantee these energy supplies are just going to go out onto the open market and pay as much as they can for that to occur?
I think we're probably going to be okay for the dominant reason that the amount of coal that is being put back into production has, bloomed. And ultimately, at the peak of the energy crisis, we highlighted something first for our Pro Tier subscribers and then in one of our pieces that really was a historic anomaly, which is that the price of coal on an energy content basis exceeded that of oil. Even though oil historically had always been a higher value commodity, you could make, diesel and gasoline and lubricants and chemicals and glues and asphalt out of oil. You can only really burn coal to make heat. And yet, at the peak of the energy crisis, coal was deemed to be more valuable than oil, which we interpreted to be a sign of stagflation, which is in fact what has transpired. And so now that that historical relationship has regressed back to its normal behavior, oil now is on an energy basis more valuable than coal. not by much. But the market signaling effect of the price of coal brought back on, lots of marginal supply. And the hysteresis effect of Germany's behavior heading into this winter, we believe will send a strong message to the emerging world that they just need to keep bidding up coal, and they need to keep stockpiling coal. And we'll see if Germany shuts down coal plants it brought back online. I doubt that they will. They just have this weird hatred for nuclear power, which is kind of stupid, but is what it is. And then, much depends on the U.S. shale patch. Natural gas is down to $2 per million BTU in the U.S., but it's trapped. Our LNG exports are back to full throttle with Freeport LNG finally being allowed to reopen after the winter. So I suspect that $15 to $18 per million BTU LNG, Dutch TTF prices, Europe will be able to fill its storage capacities for far less price. And so long as the world keeps digging up coal, we should be in pretty good shape for next winter, barring, of course, a 3 or 4 sigma weather event to the cold side. And so I do think, and we have said on other podcasts, that the energy crisis is over. The lessons from the energy crisis are being learned, good and bad. And we are close to the edge, but I would say that the worst is past.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's been more focus on, as we've mentioned, like energy security rather than, I guess, the green agenda that we've seen sort of shape Europe over the past 10 years or so. Do you think there's been a shift towards, okay, we have to make sure that we actually have enough energy before being able to transition?
Yeah, I think the fallacy of the big lie that's been told and sold to voters is that we can wean ourselves off fossil fuels with no consequence and no hit to our standard of living. And if there's anything that 2022 showed us is that lie has been revealed to anyone who wants to see it. Now, the hardcore environmentalist will claim and double down by saying that the only solution is to do even more of what we did that caused the crisis in the first place. We suspect that Biden's behavior is sort of proof that when push comes to shove, most leaders won't sacrifice the standard of living of the people they represent in pursuit of sort of the more religious aspects of the climate change dogmatic movement. And I think many saw what happened in Germany and took the correct lessons. And by many, I mean a plurality of the global population. We're talking 5 billion people don't care about climate change and care about increasing the standard of living of their population. And so I famously had a fascinating debate / conversation with Professor Steve Keen on this matter. And we both agreed that we're going to run the experiment. We're not going to cut our carbon emissions, and we're going to run the climate change experiment. And if the alarmists are correct, as I said on that podcast, it's time to break out your favorite bottle of wine because there's no need to save it. But I think human ingenuity will mean that we'll do just fine, and we'll be able to react to whatever consequences might occur. But we are going to run the experiment. Carbon emissions are not going to be cut. Fossil fuels are going to continue to be burned. Many in the West will waste lots of money on wind and solar. That'll just be an inflationary pulse resulting in not much in the way of change in the way energy is extracted and utilized. And that's just the status quo, and that's the way it's going to be.
So when you say inflationary policy, that's obviously for the energy it produces, but also the commodities that are provided to create
and
that
the money
production.
that's wasted. Any money that's just spent for money's sake and doesn't give you a return, it by definition is sort of an inflationary pulse. And we'll see shortages in various critical materials, or imagine there's some we call them high barrier pinch points. Some critical material that's needed to make wind blades more effective or solar panels more efficient, or pick your favorite. When they go short, prices will skyrocket. The suppliers of those high barrier pinch points will take a lot of the value. Nobody else in the value chain will make any money. Lots of public money will be wasted, and we'll end up with more debt and less infrastructure than we could have otherwise had. If we'd just taken all that money and built nuclear power plants, we could have solved the problem by now. But we won't, and so it's just one of the things we pride ourselves on is recognizing what will be, not wishing what it should be. So.
Yeah, it's always the issue. And what we're seeing at the moment is actually like quite I guess, a drop in some of those essential commodities, I guess you could say, for the transition. So lithium and other commodities. Do you have any insights into that and what we're seeing there? Is it just the fact that the markets are so cyclical and there's this demand and supply shift?
Yeah, I would say when you say drop, if you scroll out 3 or 4 years on the time axis, you'll see that they're still pretty extraordinarily elevated. One of the interesting challenges as an analyst is, what is rate limiting? What is the material that will limit the penetration of a new technology? Because it only takes 1 0 to know what the answer is, right? And so once that limit is reached, then actually the growth projections are impossible, and the market may have been pricing growth projections, say for lithium, that were unrealistic relative to, say, the source of cobalt or nickel, or even copper. I'm not saying I'm prepared to identify which of those constraints are today limiting, because it's kind of hard to tell, but the market may have overshot, for example, the speed with which electric vehicle penetration will capture market share, because there's just not enough battery materials, and we'll eventually reach that limit. And when we do, all the markets that are projecting, long-term growth that far exceeds any particular critical constraint will have to reprice. And we may be seeing the beginnings of that now. Because it can only be that the same people demanding full battery electric vehicles while simultaneously opposing all new mines, it can only be that eventually we will meet one of those constraints and growth will have to slow. And when growth slows, the long-term projections for all of the metals that are needed for the growth will probably have to come down.
Yeah, it seems like there's always this cyclical excitement and mass investment, and then there's the oh wait, we spent too much and we have too much supply of a certain thing for the short term, and then it's sort of like the opposite occurs. It's just this.
Yeah, this is why central planning doesn't work, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So we've maybe shift a little bit. You released an article recently. I think it was your most recent one about sort of the Bitcoin, and actually, I think it's CZ, who's the famous founder of Binance, and the impact that they have on the Bitcoin price and Tether as well. So I'm not sure if you want to go more into that, because I found it really interesting.
Always happy to talk about a piece that we've written. The piece you mentioned is one that we published on April 4th called Price Discoveries. And that piece actually comes on the 1-year anniversary of a controversial piece we put out called A Spot of Bother for Bitcoin. And in A Spot of Bother, said in my best British sounding voice, we highlighted why we believe the Securities and Exchange Commission was refusing to allow a spot ETF for Bitcoin to be approved. And it's because that would allow US fiat dollars to flow into the crypto universe. The US has a vibrant Bitcoin futures market, but that market is a sort of walled garden of US accredited investors who are making dollar bets on a reference price of Bitcoin. And the futures contract itself does not involve US dollars leaving the fiat world and going into the crypto universe. Now, many players in the futures market may indeed be going into the crypto universe to hedge, but the specific bets of the futures do not. And that's why there is a futures ETF that tracks the price of Bitcoin. BITO is the symbol. If you're a retail investor and you want to make a speculative bet on the price of Bitcoin, you could buy BITO. But they will not allow the approval of a Bitcoin spot ETF, because inflows to such an ETF would necessarily cause the operators of that ETF to go and buy Bitcoin, i.e. fiat money going into the crypto universe, acting essentially as exit liquidity for crypto whales. That piece triggered an avalanche of hate in the comments. And in fact, we launched our paid service 2 days later, and we decided, in large part because of the hate we received in the comments from trolls, that we would limit our comments to paying subscribers, under the view that feel free to troll us in the comments all you want, but at least pay us for the privilege. 1 year later, we wrote Price Discoveries, and basically everything we wrote in that piece, A Spot of Bother, was validated by a recent charging document issued by the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which highlights some really amazing facts. In the post-FTX world, some 92% of the trading volume in Bitcoin is occurring on Binance, which is a sort of a shady exchange run by this character, CZ. Doesn't appear to have super strong know your customer AML, anti-money laundering rigorous oversight, and the charging document, in fact, while civil, reads like a criminal complaint that the Department of Justice might issue, and we suspect we might see some of those soon. It turns out that on Binance, CZ and his exchange trade against their customers all the time, directly, and they have some 300 in-house accounts. And presumably unlimited access to Tether. And so in our view, the price of Bitcoin is what CZ says it is. And Bitcoin should not be quoted in US dollars. It should be quoted in tethers. So if Bitcoin is 28,000 tethers today, that's how we should quote it. Because that's the dominant quote unquote currency that Bitcoin is traded in. And so when you go and you actually read the complaint, and then you read the reasons why the SEC has been telling everybody who has applied for a spot Bitcoin ETF why they're being rejected, it makes a lot of sense. And let me read to you the exact language the SEC has been using over and over and over again. Quote, does not sufficiently contest the presence of possible sources of fraud and manipulation in the Bitcoin spot market generally that the Commission has raised in previous orders. Such possible sources have included 1, wash trading, 2, persons with a dominant position in Bitcoin manipulating Bitcoin pricing, 3, hacking of the blah, 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 4, malicious control, 5, trading based on material non-confidential information, and 6, manipulative activity involving the purported stablecoin Tether, and finally, 7, fraud and manipulation at Bitcoin trading platforms. This reads like the SEC has known that this civil charging document would be heading Binance's way for a very long time. In our view, the CTFC document proves that they have key insiders who have flipped. They know exactly what's going on in Binance, and they intend to put CZ in jail and Binance out of business. That's how we read it as outside observers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Is there a way for Bitcoin to actually disconnect from Binance, and I guess you could say Tether, or would that just yeah?
I mean, until it does, it's not. We've written several pieces on what Nick Carter has famously coined Operation Choke Point 2.0. The existence of that operation is somehow controversial. We don't think it's controversial at all. We think it's quite clear that the US government is proactively cracking down on all things crypto, and Bitcoin will likely be a casualty of that crackdown. It's hard to imagine a world where you could limit Bitcoin trading to, KYC AML investors only. In fact, it's designed to not have such government influence over the network. And so in a world where Bitcoin trading could never be KYC AML, then Bitcoin could ultimately be banned in the US. We don't think that's a stretch. And we're not saying we would support such a ban. We're just observing how the US government behaves, how seriously they take the Bank Secrecy Act, and the desire of the US Treasury Department to be the Eye of Sauron, as Ben Hunt famously and brilliantly characterized them. They want to see every transaction in the world because controlling money is controlling power, and the US is nothing if not power hungry. And so I think objectively, it is easy to imagine a world where Bitcoin is banned in the United States. And that doesn't mean that it can be enforced or that you can't store your Bitcoin on a flash drive and tell the government that you lost the keys and put it in a safe and wait 50 years for when it's legal and pull it back out and suddenly you're rich again. But much like gold was banned for several decades in the US, we think it's entirely possible. You should at least be prepared for the concept. Again, we don't say these things that in support of such policy changes. We say them as the product of relatively neutral observation of the authorities.
Yeah, that'd be amazing to think. And I know I was listening to an interview you did recently talking about Signature Bank and how they let it fail because it's really acted as that on-ramp off-ramp between the US dollar and sort of crypto.
Well, it's humorous to watch the authorities deny that crypto had anything to do with it, when in reality, and Barney Frank has been pretty loud on this, was a former congressman and a board member of Signature Bank. Mark Cahodas, who's a short seller and a friend of ours, called this a money laundering scandal with a crypto wrapper, and I think he's right. And we wrote a piece called Don Jerome. This was like the end of The Godfather Part 1, where Michael takes over and the promise to keep the peace died with his father, and he doesn't take very long to assert the manner in which he intends to lead the family, and takes care of all the family business on one fateful day while he's standing, at his nephew's baptism. This had a bit of a Don Jerome feel to it, Sunday night throwaway paragraph. Oh yeah, by the way, Signature Bank is kneecapped and doesn't exist anymore. Came as a complete surprise to management. in the absence of their crypto division, would Signature Bank still exist today? I think it's undeniable. Yeah, I do. And any run that may have happened before Signature Bank was seized was probably the market realizing that having this crypto division was pretty toxic and that Don Jerome was on his way. And so, yeah, of course, they took him out because of the crypto bank. And to say otherwise, we believe is silly.
And are there any other similar crypto banks this could be an issue in the near future, or have they gone
Yeah, I
down?
mean, they got the two big ones, Silvergate and Signature. There's a few others. Morgan Stanley had a piece out last week quoting a few of the banks. I don't want to give the names because some of them are small banks and we don't want to sort of participate in causing any undue alarm. But there's a few banks out there, and the market is sniffing out who they are, and their stocks are coming under pressure. But there will be, at some point, the Feds run the risk of creating contagion, and so the benefit of taking out a small player for crypto runs against the potential risk of a broader run on regional and community banks, which is something we've written about that would be very devastating to the U.S. economy. And so I think they've sent the message, and banks will be given the rope they need to rid themselves of anything and everything to do with crypto, and the ones that don't ultimately are stupid, given the signals that are coming from the regulator. So we shall see. But I'd say 90% of the problem was excised with Signature and Silvergate's demise.
Yeah, I feel like any risk manager would just be like, no way, there's no chance that we're even going to look at crypto anymore because of what's happened.
You would think.
Yeah, we'll find out. So, Doomberg, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Yeah, my last question is, what is one message you want people to take away from our conversation?
Uh, Go to doomberg.substack.com and sign up for a fantastic commentary like we just discussed. But no, in all seriousness, we're very proud of the Doomberg Substack and really appreciate the chance to come on your show, and always happy to have such vigorous discussion.
Yeah, perfect. Awesome. I'll put the Substack below. And I know you also have a great Twitter where you're always keeping up to date with what's happening. And so, yeah, I'll put that all in the description below. But thanks again.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.